I think the Wolfenstein series is probably the longest running series in the entire FPS genre. I mean, nothing else really comes to mind. And for me, it all started with Wolfenstein 3D, the first shooting game I ever played. All the way back at the tender age of 5 years old on my dad's Commodore 286. I've watched my boy BJ go through a whole heap of redesigns and changes throughout the years, and each new installment I've always been happy to see him back. So I thought I'd go through all of these games and rank them in what I think is the order from worst to best. Simply because my life is dope and I do dope shit. Now, unless you've played all of these games, you can also expect the odd spoiler here and there, so be warned. And I'll say that this is only going to be the main games in the series, all of the main entries, so to speak. I'm not going to break them down into ports and all that kind of nonsense, because that can change the quality of a game dramatically. And we'd be here all day arguing about which port is best until we all bleed from our assholes. Also, I won't be including enemy territory in this list. I mean, yes, it was an awesome game and you and your buddies all played it when you were 15 years old. I get it. But this is about the single player games primarily. Can you dig it? Lastly, this video is just my opinion and nothing else. I'm not claiming my word is gospel. So if you don't agree with what I have to say, well, don't take it to heart, alright, you little bitch. Having said that, let's get right into it. Okay, so the worst games I think in the entire main series are the Spear of Destiny. Okay, so the worst games I think in the entire main series are the Spear of Destiny mission packs named Return to Danger and Ultimate Challenge. Yeah, I bundled these ones together. The Ultimate Challenge here being if your patience can hold out long enough to not put your fist through the goddamn monitor. These mission packs are bad for a couple of key reasons. Firstly, they mess around with the sprite work in a pretty severe way, changing every single sprite in the game to something that looks positively amateurish. The original sprites from Wolfenstein 3D and Spear of Destiny did show their age, but they had character and personality. Here, everything just looks generic and boring, like why are all the guns blue, for instance? Oh, and the best bit, the mutants from Chapter 2 are now replaced with bats that fly around and shoot at you. No, seriously. They couldn't even be bothered changing around the par times for each level, or the names of each boss you encounter from those in Spear of Destiny. I mean, it's just lazy across the board. The other main issue is the level design, and to call it maze-like is an understatement. It feels like someone scrumpled up a piece of paper, ate it, shat it out, and then drew what came out of their ass. I mean, look, not the classiest analogy, but you get the point. You often have to find secret walls to progress as well, meaning you have to go through an entire level just mashing that interact button on every surface. It's just not very fun. Even with a source port that allows for an auto map, these levels are unnecessarily confusing. And for those two reasons, these mission packs find their spot at the bottom of the list. Now, it might be a bit controversial putting this one so far down, but I really do think that Machine Games' 2017 sequel to The New Order was just a massive letdown. The original reboot had a good mix of gameplay and cinematics, allowing the player to murder lots of Nazis in gloriously violent fashion, but also tell an interesting story, with characters you're rooted for and a motivation and plot you could get behind and understand. Wolfenstein the New Colossus just flushes all of that down the toilet, seemingly more interested in delivering a trashy, poorly written story, jumping the shark so often that it just becomes ludicrous and batshit insane. As an example of how frequent and lengthy the cinematics in this one are, originally in the New Order there was maybe roughly 2.5 hours of cinematics, but in the New Colossus there's closer to 4 hours, and the overall length of the campaign is much shorter too. When the game actually lets you shoot things, it excelled, because the shooting in these games really is amazing stuff. If only they didn't bog each area down with those annoying commanders that call in reinforcements. A massive spike in the difficulty modes, however, meant that combat on the higher difficulties now required a much more reserved style of gameplay, removing that run and gun feel from the New Order and the Old Blood, diminishing the shooting even further. Overall, the whole thing was just troubling. It seemed to have some kind of weird political message that it couldn't really vocalize. The gameplay was sporadic and the writing was stupid and inconsistent, and I think this showed a lot in the sales as well.
The toilet works.
It didn't just die, it was murdered. Spear of Destiny was the follow-up to Wolfenstein 3D, and it was also released in the same year. It's a prequel to the events in Wolfenstein 3D as BJ heads to the notorious Castle Nuremberg, exploring 20 floors to retrieve the eponymous spear for the Allies. Now, Spear of Destiny isn't a bad game, it still plays fine in 2018. The thing is that it's really more of an expansion pack than a sequel. And a lot like the mission packs, it's another example of just bizarre and often irritating level design. Rooms with no symmetry, flow, or structure that just seem to be completely randomized. It's a classic example of just throwing shit at a wall to see what sticks, and what you end up with is a game with a lot of inconsistencies. Some levels are enjoyable, others are frustrating messes, forcing constant save scumming to avoid death around every corner. There's no new weapons and no new enemy types outside of a few bosses, which function the same as other bosses from Wolfenstein 3D anyway. And instead of the episodic structure, it's just 20 floors one after the other. I think the only real new addition is the inclusion of ammo boxes or crates instead of just picking up weapon magazines, but that's about it. I do like that it has a higher enemy count than Wolfenstein 3D, making it a lot more action-packed, and the end twist where BJ's teleported to hell is actually pretty cool. But still, it can't really hold a candle to its predecessor. Still though, BJ doesn't get his head cut off and we don't have to sit through hours of cringy dialogue, so it still beats out the new Colossus in my books.
This is Agent BJ Blazkowicz. Wake up the director. Tell him we have to meet as soon as I land.
In 2009, Raven Software took a stab at rebooting the franchise after an 8-year hiatus with Wolfenstein. Yeah, just Wolfenstein. With something of an open world approach, it featured BJ with a new look in the fictional town of Eisenstadt, carrying out all manner of missions for the Kreisau Circle. It even brought back Hans Gross from Wolfenstein 3D, who serves as a boss fight later on. The new addition to the game was this thing called the Black Sun Dimension, which BJ could access with the Thule Medallion. When you did this, the world would kind of shift you into this nightmarish, otherworldly version of your surroundings, giving you increased movement speed and allowing you to interact with objects you couldn't normally see. Enemies were also highlighted, making them easier during combat, and it was generally just more effective than running around without this activated. Throughout the game and using the medallion, you'd also get access to what were pretty much superpowers, like being able to do increased damage or shield yourself from incoming attacks. And you could literally stop time, even sending out a powerful shockwave that could vaporize your enemies. It was pretty damn awesome, and the high enemy count during combat really let you go ham with these abilities. For some reason though, a lot of people really didn't like this game, which was something I never quite understood. My main issue with this one though were the boss fights, which I do think were horribly designed and borderline broken on hard mode. Other than that, I guess it did at times not feel like a Wolfenstein game. I mean, it could just be a pretty generic open world military shooting game. Another thing is that the game just becomes way too easy later on, because the upgraded medallion and the weapons available to the player were just really overpowered. Using an upgraded Tesla gun, for instance, I almost feel bad for the Nazis. I mean, they just don't stand a chance. Makes the Tesla gun in Return to Castle Wolfenstein look like Static Shock by comparison. Not to mention a weapon like the particle gun that just quite literally disintegrates them. Overall, I think it was a pretty good game and a worthy entry. It's just a shame it's so hard to get a copy of it nowadays. Next up, we've got Wolfenstein 3D, the granddaddy of first-person shooters, and as I said before, the first FPS game I ever played. I'd really like to put this thing higher up on the list, but in terms of how it plays, there's other games out there that are more accessible and enjoyable.
Yeah!
Wolfenstein 3D still holds up okay for the most part, but it can be really hard to get into. Obviously, again, playing as BJ, the game is broken up into 3 main missions and 3 prequel missions. In the main missions, you're escaping Castle Wolfenstein before then tracking down a chemical warfare scientist. Before the final mission where you hunt down and kill Hitler himself in what's one of the most iconic boss fights in all of gaming. I mean, goddamn son, it's Mecha Hitler. Wolfenstein 3D looks simple on the surface, but it's also pretty clever in certain aspects as well. A big component of the game was noise, so when you're moving around levels, it was common for enemies to sneak up behind you. So you had to keep your ears open for the sound of opening doors and be aware of your surroundings. Every enemy type in the game, except for those asshole mutants, made a distinct noise when they were alerted, letting you know exactly what kind of enemy you're up against instantly. This was something that got replicated again with Doom, and even more in Doom 2, with enemies like the Mancubus and the Revenants. There were 4 weapons in the game: the knife, the Luger pistol, the MP40 and the chain gun. But you'd mostly use the MP40 and the chain gun for just clearing out rooms when you had enough ammo. And unloading with this bad boy was always hella satisfying. It's a basic game, but the whole thing kind of works, and the only thing that detracts from it a little bit is the often artificial difficulty on some of the later levels, particularly those in episode 6, which are just downright sadistic. Levels could often devolve into a key hunt, and you'd spend a fair bit of time searching for that one room that you'd missed, but it wasn't quite as bad as Spear of Destiny or those mission packs. Survival in this game is pretty much just about reflexes over everything else, and with certain enemies like the SS and the officers, if they got off the first shot, you were usually screwed. It is enjoyable with the source port and a lot of patience, but it sure does show its age. Still though, it's as fun as ever, shooting Mecha Hitler with a chain gun and stabbing pixelated German shepherds with a knife.
Yeah!
Now, Machine Games might have buggered up Wolfenstein the New Colossus back in 2017, but in 2014 they hit the nail on the head, I think, with the New Order. This one starts off with a pretty grim prologue as BJ is attacking the compound of an evil Nazi scientist named Wilhelm Strauss, set in the final days of the war as the Allied forces are desperately trying to secure victory. Despite his best efforts though, he fails and the Nazis win, eventually taking over the world after dropping atom bombs on the country still resisting. Stuck in a comatose state for 15 years, BJ finally awakens in an asylum in what's one of the best waking up out of a coma moments I think of all time.
Nazi scum.
He then sets off to free the resistance fighters and to bring the Nazi war machine to a crashing halt. What ensues is a lengthy campaign with well-written dialogue, fantastic shooting, plenty of nods to the old games, and just the right amount of schlock. This was the game that helped bring the series to a new generation, not to mention it helped the renaissance of these pseudo old-school shooters. It is pretty similar to the New Colossus in terms of how the game plays, but the main difference is that the New Order has much of a focus on actual gameplay. It still has those sections where you're given the option to take a more stealthy route, taking out commanders to avoid reinforcements being called in, but the difficulty modes are a lot more lenient, especially the higher difficulties, allowing you to take more damage before dying, making combat more viable and ultimately more satisfying. Not only that, but there's way more sections during missions where you're able to just go in guns blazing, taking on droves of Nazis who you can mercilessly mow down with assault rifles or automatic shotguns. One of my favourite sections in the entire game is this one inside a U-boat where it's just you and the Nazis in these cramped hallways. And combined with Mick Gordon's thumping soundtrack, it shows you just how good the combat can be. It's far from perfect though, and the major letdown I think is the inconsistency with the missions. I think the New Order is at its best in the more interior locations where you can run and gun, but there's sections in the game where you almost have to play it like a cover shooter. The game has a mechanic where if you're in cover you can aim down sights and the game's going to automatically peek for you, allowing you to shoot easily. There's even a perk that requires 80 kills from cover to unlock, so it seems they really designed these sections with cover shooting in mind. It's fine and dandy, but it's just not as fun as barreling into a room with dual assault rifles. Still though, I can't really fault this game all that much. It manages to balance story with gameplay, and most of the gameplay is pretty damn good. It's the right kind of schlock too, without ever really jumping the shark. Shooting Nazis on the moon with dual laser guns, for instance, is just so dope. Speaking of dope, there's The Old Blood, which is like a shorter, more compact version of the New Order, released in 2015. Now, I'm not sure how entirely this storyline carries over into the New Order, considering how outlandish it is, but the events are a prequel to the New Order, with the objective of the game being for BJ to find a dossier which reveals the location of Wilhelm Strauss's compound, the compound that's attacked in the prologue of the New Order. But look, it doesn't matter, because all you need to know is that this game takes everything the New Order did and does it even better. For starters, the game is just chock full of combat, and that's good, solid, meaty, turn Nazis into pulp kind of combat. You get long stretches of this game where you can just shoot Nazis to your heart's intent without barely being interrupted, and it is fucking fantastic. Then about halfway through the game, zombies fall out of the sky, quite literally, and now you're shooting zombies with a sawn-off shotgun. And then the whole thing's topped off with a boss fight against an ancient monstrosity. It is short, only around 3 or 4 hours long, but it's sweet. It's like the video game equivalent of a pocket rocket. The story loses a bit of its impact, and you do feel like your mission is kind of redundant, considering in the grand scheme of things you ultimately fail. But still, gameplay-wise, I think this is as good as the recent reboots have ever been, and it's a must-play. I may like the New Order, but I love The Old Blood, and it's everything a Wolfenstein game should be. So what's possibly going to beat that, you're probably wondering? Well, if you haven't figured it out, the answer to that is Return to Castle Wolfenstein. Released in 2001, Return to Castle Wolfenstein is just so awesome and manly that your body is literally creating more testosterone when you're playing it. It's one of the few games that will make you its bitch, but have you coming back time and time again. I think since it first came out way back in 2001, I've probably finished it a couple of dozen times, but I know I can still load it up and not get bored. It's probably the best of the old school shooters from around the early 2000s. The only thing I can think of that rivals it for straight out shooting is maybe Soldier of Fortune 1. Early on, it can feel like a bit of a standard military shooter, almost like the Medal of Honor games, because initially you're carrying out missions that are only disrupting some of the Nazis' more rudimentary plans. But throughout the game, the paranormal element becomes more prominent, and eventually you have to deal with a resurrected warlord that looks like Andrew WK.
What? I live again.
In between killing leather jumpsuit wearing Nazi babes or FG-42 wielding paratroopers. In this game, you're storming Nazi castles, you're taking on undead axe-wielding ghouls in catacombs, you're moving through secret labs, blowing up horrific mutants with a Panzerschreck or a minigun. It's just pure badassery. And the whole thing's aged like a fine wine. Well, a fine wine with hints of vinegar. Why do I say that? Well, the 2 mandatory stealth missions, for instance, are extremely finicky and can be very temperamental, sometimes forcing an entire mission restart. The mutant enemies that leap at you too, I think, are just broken. And one of the boss fights in this game, I think, is just flat out unfair. Yeah, it is at times brutally difficult, but then again, that's kind of what makes it so appealing. You will probably die a fair bit, but it's okay because the F5 button is right there, letting you save whenever you want, and you will get better over time. And if you don't get better and you still suck, well, you know what, maybe Fortnite's more your cup of tea. Part of the game's strength, I think, lies in its variety in environments, meaning you never really feel like you're doing the same thing twice. And overall, the slow integration of all of the new enemy types and the weapons is just seamless, slowly progressing the player along, but also ramping up the challenge gradually so it never feels too easy. What also helps this game is the amazing soundtrack composed by Bill Brown, and some of the music in this game really help to make the action and the set pieces way more memorable. The music that kicks in the first time you encounter the elite paratroopers just lets you know right away that shit is about to get real. The intro cinematic too is incredibly awesome. I mean, just watch it and imagine being a 13-year-old kid playing this for the first time. It's mind-blowing. Even before I finally sat down to type this list up, I knew this game was going to be number 1. And if you've taken nothing else away from this video, I hope you take away the fact that this is an FPS game worth playing. Wolfenstein as a series is far from over. We've got Youngblood and Cyberpilot headed for release in 2019. And I'm sure somewhere down the line we'll also get some kind of proper sequel to the New Colossus too. I only hope Machine Games can get the series back on track. On some level though, all of these games are still worth checking out, if only to see how one of the most important series in the FPS genre has lived on over the years, and how one of the most badass protagonists is still kicking Nazi butt over 20 years later. If you feel like I missed something out or want to tell me how wrong my opinion is, well, do so in the comments section below. Anyway, thanks for watching.